Let's go. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, and thank you. First of all, thank you to the Stockholm International Water Institute and all of you who have joined today. Really nice to see you and to be with you. My name is Maura Barry, and I serve as USAID's Interim Global Water Coordinator. I also serve as USAID's Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. So I want to kick off this conversation today. And first of all, start off with some thoughts on the last 18 months and the impact that this has had on water and sanitation. I think we all remember that when the crisis started, many of us were training ourselves to sing that happy birthday song twice, right? To wash our hands. But the sad truth is that there were 3 billion people that were lacking water and soap at home to be able to wash their hands. That still remains the case. And so I think that all of us here participating in this event would agree that the COVID pandemic has challenged water security in unique ways. And I'd really like to take this moment to recognize that when the pandemic first hit, service providers, such as those working in water and sanitation, really had to overcome enormous challenges to meet just basic needs. And so I want to ask all of you on the call that you join me in recognizing and appreciating their work under very difficult circumstances. Given the critical role that water, sanitation, and hygiene play in slowing the spread of disease and preparing economies to reopen safely, I think the global community really expected extraordinary things from those service providers. And it's also important to recognize the operational challenges that many utilities faced. According to some data, bill collection rates dropped by as much as 40%, all while utilities faced increasing costs of personal protective equipment and tried to rapidly deploy new infrastructure like hand washing facilities. And in addition to the direct impacts of the pandemic, we all know that water security is increasingly under the threat from a warming planet. 90% of climate change impacts are water related. That of course includes floods, droughts, increasing water pollution. Water instability is also exacerbating disease, conflict, and migration. So while the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the largest global shocks in the WASH sector, I think we can expect more of these once in a generation shocks. And so these challenges require a new level of resilience. And in this vein, this was no different. So let me give you a few examples. In countries like Nigeria and the Philippines, we helped service providers deploy new contact-free mobile payment technologies that kept revenue flowing and it kept staff safe. In Burkina Faso, we worked with our partners to broadcast radio messages to promote hand washing with soap. And in Indonesia, USAID supported the installation of thousands of hand washing stations in vulnerable communities. And while USAID joined other donors in providing emergency subsidies to keep water and sanitation service providers solvent, there's absolutely no question that we need more investment to increase resilience and avoid these difficult situations in the future. The pandemic highlighted many structural weaknesses in our WASH programs, but at the same time, it also highlighted opportunities to strengthen resilience and to improve our collective development efforts. For example, our surveys in 5 African countries last summer showed that hours of water service had been cut for nearly 40% of the respondents. And these cuts are often essential to keep staff working and pumps to keep operating, but certainly they present a large challenge. And another long-term challenge we see is investment. While the pandemic still threatens many countries and regions, maintenance, unfortunately, has been put on hold, and that's depriving areas of new critical infrastructure. So today, the idea is to step back and capture the lessons we've learned from the pandemic and explore how those lessons can help us build resilience for a future filled with more, we know is going to be filled with more frequent shocks and stresses. So we have assembled a really exciting panel of experts today that's going to help us do just that. And to get the discussion started, I'm really pleased to introduce Vanessa Gunter. She's a colleague from USAID's WASH Partnership and Learning, or what we refer to as WASH Pals, and she's going to get the panel started. So again, thank you for joining and your participation. I look forward to the great discussion, and Vanessa, I hand it over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you to the session organizers for the opportunity to share our work today, and a warm welcome to the audience. I'd like to start off with a quote from Canadian author and activist Naomi Klein. In a recent interview with The Guardian, she states, "There's always this discourse whenever disasters hit. Climate change doesn't discriminate. The pandemic doesn't discriminate. We're all in this together. But that is not true," she says. "That is not how disasters act. They act as magnifiers and they act as intensifiers." This presentation focuses on some of these magnifiers and intensifiers, showcasing the impacts that the pandemic has on WASH services and the parallels that come along with climate-driven extreme events. Last year, USAID asked WASH Pals to analyze the effects of COVID-19 on WASH access and service delivery and products across its priority countries. The goal was to assist decision makers in an informed response to WASH-related impacts of the pandemic. Much of the work was focused on deep dives in 7 countries, and you can see them highlighted on the map on the right. WASH Pals interviewed key informants, among them service providers, government officials, the private sector, and donors, as well as conducted household surveys via SMS in deep dive countries except Nepal. We are following this work up with a longitudinal data collection study to monitor the longer term impacts. And you can find all of our reports under globalwaters/washpals.org. And that link can be shared as well. The slides that follow are based on our 2020 work, and please join me on the next slide. This slide highlights our top line findings in relation to water supply, sanitation, and the policy response. Through the first 4 to 6 months of the pandemic, though the economic shock was severe, widespread water supply disruptions were generally avoided. However, service providers have been financially and operationally stressed. When talking directly to households, our surveys reported access challenges related to COVID-19. As an example, between 1.4% and 6.4% of the respondents reported their water services declining below the GMP basic level, with the largest effects in Kenya. Reported difficulties by consumer on the sanitation side were lower than those for water supply. However, suppliers of sanitation products and services did report losses from reduced demand and higher operating expenses. To mitigate this, governments imposed free water directives in many countries, and in some, these directives were offered to customers regardless of income level and urban versus rural status. While motivated by supplying basic human needs, the result was widespread revenue losses, which have proven difficult to mitigate, especially since the service provider landscape is fragmented, particularly in peri-urban and rural Africa. So overall, the most consistent finding of our work was the financial stress being suffered by water service providers at both large and small scales, for reasons we'll walk through in the next slide. This slide conveys the cascade of effects that the pandemic shock caused, eventually impairing water service delivery and diminishing access to households. You can see the pandemic's immediate consequences with respect to WASH listed on the top of the bars. They include restrictions on movement, the free water directives, and disrupted supply chains. If we follow restrictions on movement located on the left, this leads to disrupted economic activity, which reduces earnings and depletes assets, which makes spending even on basic needs, such as water bills, more difficult. In addition, service providers were instructed to suspend fee collections from domestic customers, saw a deviation of resources towards healthcare, and experienced revenue declines from dramatic reductions on commercial and industrial water use, which compounded it in financial hardships. Finally, supplier operations became much more challenging in the face of disruptions for chemicals, fuels, and hardware, as well as hurdles from emergency response measures like temporary public water points. All these effects lead to impaired wash access to households. Next slide, please. With the world still struggling with the pandemic, reports of devastating floods, wildfires, and heat waves have come fast, serving as a painful reminder of another crisis that has still barely been adequately addressed. An unmistakable lesson from COVID-19 is that wash systems are fragile, and their fragility is laid bare by shocks. Extreme effects associated with climate change are similar to what we lay out for the pandemic, as we tried to depict in the slide. Climate shocks can also result in restrictions on movement with associated effects on household incomes, and diversions of resources outside of WASH affect service provider revenues. Disruption on local supply chains, changing migration patterns, damaged infrastructure, as well as stressed water resources during drought periods strain operations. So the impacts of climate change slightly shift, but we still see reduced household spending, reduced service provider revenues, and stressed service provider operations, which compound in less wash access. Dear audience, shocks to the wash sector, whether due to COVID-19 or the ongoing climate crisis, present themselves as mirrored images, giving us the unique opportunity to learn lessons from either. Unfortunately, as we are witnessing now, these crises often occur simultaneously, exacerbating the severity of the issue and hindering response effort. This makes the research we prepared even more important and serves as yet another dire reminder to work quickly, united, and with a sense of resilience. To follow these values, we're really fortunate to have distinguished practitioners and policymakers on the panel that follows, to explore specific measures to address these challenges. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to hand the mic back over.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I am Alyssa Boyer. I'm the Chief of Party of the Water Sanitation Hygiene Finance Program, WASHFIN, financed by the United States Agency for International Development. Our project seeks to mobilize finance to the water and sanitation sector globally. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been working with water and sanitation service providers in 6 countries to better understand the impacts of the pandemic on their operations and to help them access the support needed to deliver continuous essential services. I'm thrilled to be here today moderating this discussion with esteemed women from around the world. As we've heard from the previous speaker, COVID has had a profound impact on service providers around the world. Today, we're going to talk with service providers and their partners to better understand how those impacts and the way they were managed can help build resilience to the coming climate crisis. To start, we'll take a look at how the severe COVID-19 pandemic in Brazil impacted Sabesp, one of the largest water and sewage service providers in the world. To share her experience, we are now joined by Dr. Monica Porto in São Paulo. She is the Director of Regional Systems of Sabesp and a full professor of the Department of Hydraulic and Environmental Engineering at the Universidade of São Paulo. Monica, we know Brazil has faced immense challenges throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you give us a sense of the various ways that the pandemic and its ripple effects impacted Sabespe's ability to provide wash services to its 26 million customers?
Hi, hello to all. Hi, Alisa. Thank you very much for the invitation for Sabesp to be here as one of the providers. And as all the other providers, the COVID-19 was, still is an expressive challenge for us. The fact is that in order to face the COVID-19 pandemic, the most important measure is to keep providing water supply service 24/7. So Sabesp has 100% water supply coverage in urban areas, but we have the challenge of reaching informal settlements. So in these areas where the poor people are in informal settlements, through an agreement with the municipality, the district attorney's office, Sabesp began the implementation of a new program, which is called legal water, because those people are in informal settlements. So it's called legal water. And the main objective is to provide full water supply with potable water, good water, quality water to the poor people living in these areas. So we began this program 5 years ago here in the metropolitan region of São Paulo, and now we are expanding this program to another poor areas of the state. So additionally, during the pandemic, Sabesp implemented public lavatories, so people could could easily wash their hands. And also Sabesp participated in campaigns to distribute hygiene products. So poor people could not only use the lavatories, but to have the products for their hygiene. So it is not an easy task. But Sabesp keeps investing in the infrastructure, in expanding the infrastructure. Mainly now we are very concerned in expanding in those poor areas, in the illegal settlements. And what we see is that the investment that we have been made in the last years are proving very correct right now, and so we are much more confident in our ability to provide service for all.
That's great. Thank you, Monica. That's really good example of how, investments that Sabesp began making before the pandemic proved so incredibly valuable once hit with an unexpected event such as the pandemic. So we know that every service provider is not a Sabesp though. So to help understand the bigger picture, we'll now turn to Nishta Mehta, a water and sanitation specialist at the World Bank with a wide range of experience working with water and sanitation service providers. Nishta, you and your team have been working with utilities around the world to help them address the impacts of COVID-19. Are the impacts that Monica mentioned unique to Brazil, or are you seeing similar impacts in other contexts? And are there any other major impacts that you're seeing?
Thank you, Alyssa. It really is an honor to be here among such esteemed panelists. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the question. So Dr. Porto has very articulately laid out the challenges faced by Sabesp and how these were addressed. And you're right, not every utility is a Sabesp. We've seen similar challenges in other countries as well, with varying degrees. Vanessa covered the issue of supply chain disruption. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other major impacts that we've seen. I'm grouping these impacts into a few categories: increased demand and increased vulnerability in service areas, revenue disruption, which is something that Moira talked about as well, and then finally, health and safety of utility workers. So a recent World Bank tool for identifying pandemic hotspots pointed to low-income communities in cities where there were inadequate public services, especially inadequate waste management and sanitation. These areas were seen as significant source of risk for contagion in cities such as Cairo, Mumbai, Cape Town, and others. People living in these communities often use shared sanitation facilities, use shared water points, and these became hotspots or transmission hotspots for COVID-19. The vulnerability of these populations increased significantly during COVID-19 pandemic. This increased the pressure on utilities to provide services in these areas, including hand washing facilities, additional wash infrastructure, significantly. And I mentioned this because I want to point out that utilities had to do a lot in a very short time and with much fewer resources, significantly increasing the pressure on these service providers. And when we talk of resources, I also want to talk about revenue disruption. We've heard about revenue disruption from a few of the earlier speakers as well. Many large users of water downscaled or reduced activities, resulting in declining demand. A decline in demand from industrial and commercial users due to lockdowns or travel restrictions significantly affected revenues for many water utilities. Several countries also announced crisis emergency measures that affected revenue. For example, partial suspension of water billing, particularly for low-income users, which was essential at that time, but affected the revenue of service providers. Moratoriums on water service cutoffs. And this has been common across many cities. We've seen many Latin American cities have instituted these measures. We've seen these measures in Asian cities as well. A result of all of this, and of course the competing demands for resources, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that capital expenditure is expected to decline in the short and medium term in our sector. New capital projects are likely to be delayed as municipalities prioritize OPEX and prioritize emergency response. And it is currently unclear how much CapEx will decline or how long it's going to take us to go back to the pre-crisis investment level. And as we know, our sector is already affected by lower investment, so this is going to be a significant challenge for service providers. The other thing, operational continuity and flexibility are key to keep essential water and sanitation services running. Operations were affected by the increased risk of contagion amongst utility staff, including routine operations and construction works. Many governments across the world identified staff of utilities as essential workers, enabling utilities to maintain continuity of service. However, this also increased the risk of utility staff for contracting the disease, particularly as they went out to manage construction, repairs, operational management, reading of meters, etc. And similar issues were seen even more in sort of the vulnerable workers in our sector. For example, sanitation workers, such as toilet attendants and fecal sludge septic tank emptiers that were providing essential services during the pandemic in crowded spaces without PPEs or protective gears that was placing them at risk. These impacts have affected many utilities across the world, and we're going to need to think about how we can help these service providers sort of recover from this in the upcoming sort of, post-pandemic world that I hope we're going to enter soon. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nishta. I think I know the World Bank is currently supporting so many providers as they navigate the crisis now, and I guess the impacts on the reductions in capital expenditures is something that certainly makes me very nervous about our ability to weather the impacts ahead. So I think the impacts of the pandemic on service providers have certainly been significant, whether they serve 25 million people or tens of thousands. So to see how service providers have been managing to sustain services in the midst of these shocks and how the lessons learned might help address future climate shocks, I want to bring Diana Makwaba into the discussion here. Diana is the managing director of Incana Water Supply and Sanitation Company, serving over 70,000 customers in the Copperbelt region of Zambia, and notably the first female CEO among Zambia's 11 commercial utilities. Diana, I know you faced many of the challenges we've heard so far. Could you share how Incana Water has been able to continue providing services in the face of these shocks, and to what extent you expect the lessons learned and changes made will help you and your team address future climate shocks?
Thank you so much for having me as part of this great panel to share our lessons, our experiences with COVID-19. I think no doubt, as the previous panelists have shared, the COVID-19 has had severe challenges in the provision of service to our customers. As a water service provider, we needed to ensure that we continue to provide water and sanitation services despite the challenges. And it was made clear by our government that water was very key in the fight against COVID-19. So hence the need for us to ensure continued service provision. So we had to ensure that our workers were working in a safe environment, especially those in continuous operations. We had to ensure that we provided hand washing facilities, fumigated the workplace. So we put in place what we are calling a task force, or more or less a COVID-19 coordinating team to help with the response, so that we were able to put in a rotational schedule for staff, and also those that could work remotely could also work remotely, and we had to put in place mechanisms to do that. As my colleagues have said, we faced a number of challenges, such as reduced revenues, because a number of institutions had to close. We also saw less payments coming from our customers. Because of the need to provide a continued service, we could not disconnect customers for non-payment. So apart from the fact that our customers were also faced with economic challenges, they also were not paying in most cases, and that led to reduced revenues. We saw that we also had challenges in sourcing some of our materials, but we had to ensure that regardless, we needed to continue providing a service. So we embarked on a survival plan where we had to ensure we cut down on some of the costs, some of the costs such as fuel, especially that we had to resort to virtual meetings and had to use more of IT. We also had to reschedule some of our programs. We also could not be able to undertake some of our projects and programs, and that of course did affect our service. But through our survival plan, through a strong, robust risk management plan, we were able to still continue providing a service. Also, our regulator requested us to submit an emergency response plan, which they shared with other partners. And we also had invested in automation, automated meters, prepaid meters, and we saw that that helped us very much. And also payment through remote, through electronic payment systems, electronic billing, that came in very handy during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I must say that we also did receive support from partners. We received support from government. We got our payment for some of our outstanding bills, and that helped us to cushion the situation. We also had support from government through, from UNICEF through government on chemicals, and that also helped to cushion. So with these plans and programs that we put in place, we drew a number of lessons, because now we've begun working in a different way, and also working through various partners. We have partners such as our team from Netherlands, where we're implementing the Waterwoods project. And through that program, we're able to have conductivity meters for online monitoring of our water sources. So we've had a number of lessons that we've learned from the COVID-19, which we are really looking at applying for future.
Thank you, Diana. It sounds like you and your team were able to mobilize very quickly to assemble, response to the pandemic. And so I can definitely see how that experience will be helpful in addressing future shocks. Hopefully not. Maybe you have a little more time to respond to some of the future ones. But so let me go back to Monica. So Monica, for you all in Brazil, the climate crisis isn't looming in front of you. It's already here. You had a severe drought in 2014 and another one that is ongoing today. So I'm curious if you have found that lessons from one shock can help build resilience to other shocks. And did you find that any steps taken from the last drought helped in responding to the COVID pandemic? And are there lessons from COVID that are helping as you address the current drought?
Yes, Alyssa, I think that the lessons worked in both ways. Both the drought and the COVID pandemic mutually benefited from the same solutions. In both cases, what is more important is to be able to provide reliable water supply service. And also in both cases, infrastructure was the key. So Sabesp has been investing in increasing resilience of our water supply systems since 2014 drought. And we are now confirming that this decision was correct. The type of actions that we did back in the last drought was to build additional and redundant water sources, systems, robustness of the distribution system. We increased the flexibility of our water distribution systems. So for instance, in the city of São Paulo, we can reach almost any point of the city from at least 2 water supply systems. So this improved the robustness of the system. And we now have more information and monitoring of our hydrologic situation. And but I think that the most important was that we learned back with the drought on how to bring the population along, and so to work with information and transparency, so the population can clearly understand what is going on and contribute in using the water more wisely. And so I think that all these measures that were learned in the hard way back in 2014 contributed to overcome both the challenges of the current drought and the pandemic. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Monica. I suppose it's, I know it's hard to get the public behind investment programs a lot of times when the benefits are intangible initially. But, I suppose that's one of the benefits of this pandemic, is that now, the investments that you have made have been validated as essential and for better or worse. So I just wanted to mention to our audience as well that we are going to leave time for questions, and so we welcome you to go ahead and start typing those into the chat box, and we'll take as many as we can as we finish. So I'm going to go back to Nishta, I think. Well, so actually, let me go to Diana first. So as you continue to address the pandemic challenges, you are starting to see the impacts of the climate crisis in Zambia as well. While COVID-19 certainly helped build resilience, as you've mentioned, what else still needs to happen to make sure that you're able to continue providing services as these types of shocks become more common due to the climate crisis? And do you think it will take another shock to build the type of resilience you'll need over the coming decade, or are you able to take some of the steps now?
Thank you, Alyssa. I think that with what we have gone through, the number of lessons that we can really begin to apply to future shocks, I think there's need to, we've learned to mobilize resources for operations and for investment so that we're able to respond to some of our future shocks in terms of investment in infrastructure. We realize there's need for survival emergency response plans, medium term and long term, to be able to respond to some of the circumstances. And we've also found that taking advantage of the situation can help us to make savings. Even through COVID, we've learned to have virtual meetings and save on physical meetings. That has helped us to reduce costs. We've also seen the need, the use of technology, and we've been able to invest in some of the automation for our meters, as I had already shared. We also see the need for partnerships with various institutions. We have a partnership with WASHFIN, as you are aware, partnerships, I think, with various other institutions. The World Bank shared with us a model that we're also using to be able to work on some of these contingency plans. So really, we have learned a lot that we can actually apply to the future. So we just ensure all these risk management plans are in place, and we need also support from our governments to be able to continue to be resilient as well in future shocks. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I hear the importance of continuing to work together to prepare ourselves for the next challenges. So that's clear to me. So finally, Nishta, as we know, the World Bank has been pivotal both in helping utilities address urgent financial needs resulting from COVID-19 and also helping water utilities build resilience to the climate crisis. Can you share any lessons the bank learned from COVID response that might inform how the bank responds to future shocks?
Thanks, Alyssa. I think the lessons that we've learned, and this ties to what I said earlier, to my earlier responses, and really to what we've heard from both Monica and Diana as well. The pandemic reinforced the importance of access to safe and reliable water, but it also reinforced the need for water supply for vulnerable populations, to wash services for vulnerable populations living in low-income communities. It's really clear that this is very important, and unless we're able to provide these services, any future shock is going to increase vulnerabilities and increase pressures on utilities. So I think understanding this and building this into all our projects, which is something that we already do, is going to be really critical for addressing future shocks. We will need to mitigate the impact of declining revenues. We will need to mitigate the impact of reduction in CapEx. This is through increased investment, through partnerships, through collaborations, and through just really working with governments and with utilities to see where those gaps are and who might be best placed to help them fill those gaps in the short and the medium term, especially. One of the things that emerged in the COVID-19 pandemic was that communication is really key to reassuring customers, keeping regulators informed, and helping employees navigate the dramatic changes that are happening. So I think incorporating this into any projects that we have or any relationships that we build with utilities is going to be really important in the future as well. I think, and this is something both Monica and Diana touched on, crisis preparedness and emergency preparedness, resiliency of staff, systems, and equipment is going to be really critical. This means having the tools that utility service providers need in the crisis in the future, including, for example, an emergency wash rapid assessment that the Water Global Practice at the World Bank's Citywide Inclusive Sanitation team developed. This helps service providers very quickly assess where are the service gaps, what are the really quick things that we can do to fill these service gaps, and who could take the responsibilities for this. So, using these tools, having emergency funds in place that can be deployed quickly, moving towards digital solutions such as e-bill pay or virtual meter readings. And this is all tied to emergency preparedness. And then finally, one more thing, and a really, really critical one, I think protecting staff and ensuring that that is a part of any emergency plan, whether it is access to appropriate PPE, training, capacity building is going to be really important to mitigate future shocks. Service providers need to strengthen support for frontline sanitation workers, including providing healthcare services and other sort of occupational risk mitigation services for these frontline workers. I think if we can focus on safe, sustainable, equitable services, emergency preparedness, firm up finance in case of dips in revenue, and really focus on communication and staff well-being, I think we'll be able to address future shocks and emergency situations in a much more proactive way. And this is something that the World Bank is very committed to doing as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nishtha. Yeah, it's just a wide variety of vulnerabilities that we all need to work together to continue to address. We do have some questions coming in, so I want to switch over to those soon. I did also just want to specify that the questions need to be added into the Pathable chat box. So it's not on the Zoom chat box. So some are coming through, and we'll address those in a minute. So I think, so just initially I wanted to thank all of our speakers for taking the time to join us today and for your incredible work to support WASH services in the face of the global pandemic. If I can go ahead and start introducing some of the questions, and then I'll finish up. So we have one that says, it seems governments played an important role in response, both in terms of policy and paying their bills. Were there any lessons learned on how to collaborate with government partners? I might direct that one to Diana, given my understanding of the role that government played in Zambia.
Thank you so much, Alisa. I think it's important to have, as we've also heard from other speakers, emergency response plans in place that we then share and communicate with our governments. And also it's important to always have that information ready in terms of our future plans and the areas where we need support. And I'm happy that there's continued dialogue with our government and also through our regulator that have helped and to support us to ensure we have these response plans in place, and there's this continued and constant communication, and also sharing the information on the performance of our utilities, and also some of the major challenges and the needs that we have to be able to provide services even to all low-income communities and other areas. So if these investment plans, response plans are in place and continuously communicated with some of the policies and programs that the government puts in place, it's actually very, very helpful. And I think I must also mention that our regulator has been in the forefront in engaging us as utilities, and that has also helped. I hope I've answered the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diana. And I think we might even have a comment from someone at the regulator indicating that I know the regulator is working with service providers to prepare emergency preparedness plans, and that they hope the utility companies become more resilient and better prepared for pandemics and emergencies. So again, it kind of gets back to that importance of working with partners to get through this together. Another one that we came in is Nishta mentioned that COVID-19 mobilized public support for service providers. Are there lessons from those public communications that can help generate similar public support for the climate crisis?
I think the answer to that is yes. I think that with COVID-19, for example, it was letting people know, hey, wash your hands. Where can you go to wash your hands? Providing really critical information that can help them, social distancing, help them protect themselves, protect their families, protect their neighbors and friends. So I think that there were several lessons that were learned from that. One was that with a really good communication campaign that focuses on getting the right messages to people is effective, and is able to change public behavior, which sort of responds to public health crisis. So I think that with the climate change, and particularly as these climate change related crises become more and more visible, I think we need to start talking to people about what are good behaviors that can help on an individual level, on a city level, on a national level, that can help address the climate change crisis, and how we can do better. So I think definitely there are lessons that we've learned through this to other public health campaigns that have been successful. For example, the polio campaign in India, and the several other campaigns. I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn about how we reach people, what kind of messages are effective, and how do we ensure that these messages reach the right people, whether it is in rural areas or in urban low-income areas, etc. So I think, yeah, definitely there are many lessons that we've learned from this that we are going to take into the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think Monica also mentioned the importance of their public campaigns in Brazil when they were dealing with their first drought crisis. So certainly saw the impact of that as well. So I have another question. In Brazil and Zambia, how are the varying level of utilities, smaller and larger, sharing in country to enable partnerships and to replicate learning based on local context? So maybe I'll ask Monica first. Has Sabespi done much work with perhaps smaller utilities that maybe don't have as many resources as Sabespi, and in helping them address similar conditions in their areas?
Yes, yes, very much so. In Brazil, the great majority of service providers are either state-owned companies. So each state in Brazil owns one state company, and this is usually the most important service provider in the state. But we have a lot of municipalities that operate their own systems. So we have been helping them, because it's usually a provider that it's the municipality that provides the service, and so it's much more difficult for them in reallocating. So we usually help them in assessing other water sources, or with some training. So there has been a collaboration between the Sabespi and the municipalities that operates their own services. Yes.
Great, thank you. And maybe just Diana, have you guys had any time to collaborate with the other CUs within Zambia, or has it just been everyone kind of dealing with their own crises in their own areas, or how has that worked?
Thank you. We have a number of collaboration programs. Some of them through our ministry, we are brought together as utilities to interact, and also some of our programs through our regulator. But I can also share one of our programs we are undertaking under Waterworks with support from the Netherlands. We are actually partnering with other utilities. So we have about 4 utilities which are part of that partnership. And there are also various proposals we are making with support as well from our regulator to source funding, where we have a mentor utility, a mentee utility, where they've identified utilities that can partner with others to share experiences. So yes, we have quite a number of partnerships. And as much as the bigger utilities have a lot to share with the smaller utilities, there are also lessons learned from the smaller utilities to help grow the bigger utilities, and also various other partnerships. And I think earlier on, I also talked about we have the investment plans, bankable projects. Once these are shared with government, then government helps us also to source the partnerships. And this can also involve 1 or more utilities. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I have a question for Nishta. Is the World Bank also supporting service providers to become more efficient in a quest to help them become more resilient? So for example, in helping them cut down on costs and non-revenue water.
Absolutely. I think that this is really a critical part of almost all our water projects with every utility that we work with. I think efficiency is sort of at the center of it, whether it is non-revenue water, financial efficiency, operational efficiency. It's something that we really focus on. And I agree that increased efficiency is going to eventually lead to increased resilience in the future, whether it is using the example of the person who asked the question, with reduction in non-revenue water means that your entire system is operating more efficiently, which means that it can withstand more shocks to the system. So I think that efficiency is something that really is at the center of most of our investments, and is important for service providers as well that we work with. So yes, thank you.
Great. Yeah, and I remember Diana also saying that that they'd found many efficiencies, even just in things as simple as taking meetings to become virtual, and that those are now going to become just standard ways of working for them. So that's all good to hear. So I have a couple more. So another one for Monica. In the last drought, you were able to make significant progress in investing for resilience. How have you been able to communicate the value of those investments to government and others, even though the impacts were not immediate?
Well, we had a very important contribution of the regulator. So the relationship with the regulator was very important in this because the regulator recognized the investment, as we say, as a prudent investment. So it was investment that was it was needed, and so the investments could be paid by tariffs. So this was a very important help from the regulator in recognizing the importance of the investment. So it was much easier to communicate with the government and the people, because it was clearly a well-recognized investment.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, and it's certainly shown to be so now. So I actually think we don't have a lot of time left. So so I am gonna, there are a couple more questions, but we'll have to hold it here. So I wanted to go back and thank all of our speakers again for taking the time to join us today, and for your incredible work in supporting WASH services in the face of a global pandemic. Thank you also to USAID for organizing this discussion and for creating the opportunity to learn from each other. So before we wrap up today's session, I wanted to invite our audience to complete a short poll. The poll is located on the Pathable page in the same box where you find the chat. So you select the poll tab at the top of the box and answer the question, did you learn something in today's session that you can apply in your work? And so we hope you say yes, but please answer either way. And so as we've heard today, when shocks occur, they pose a range of complex challenges. Economic effects mean people can't pay their water and sanitation bills. And as a result, water and sanitation service providers face rapidly decreasing revenue while still needing to provide essential services. Regulators are then put in a difficult position of balancing the interest of the public by mandating free water, for example, with balancing that with the needs of service providers. And so we've heard loud and clear that these types of shocks will not end when the current pandemic does, but instead will intensify in the future as a result of the climate crisis. So while we've heard a range of specific opportunities to prepare for the climate crisis we're already in the middle of, such as ensuring governments pay their water bills, setting up emergency operations plans, or conducting emergency scenario planning, one lesson was overwhelmingly clear, and that is now is the time to prepare for the next shock. We know it will come soon and be followed by others. So supporting investments in climate resilience now, before the next crisis strikes, is foundational in making sure that service providers can continue to provide the essential services we rely on them for, no matter what the future holds. And so if you're interested in learning more about USAID's work in building resilience for WASH, we invite you to visit globalwaters.org, and there's a wide variety of materials there for you to look at. Thank you so much to everyone again.